Episode 106. Is tap water being used to mass medicate populations? Welcome back to the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. Every time you turn on a tap, you are drinking water that has passed through treatment plants, pipes, and filtration systems. You trust that what comes out is clean, safe, and contains only what authorities say it does. But what if it contains more? Tonight's episode sits at the intersection of documented environmental science and conspiracy theory. Because the claim that pharmaceutical substances appear in public drinking water is not a theory. It is a confirmed and growing area of environmental research. What is disputed is whether this is accidental or deliberate. We have already discussed fluoride in episode 69. Tonight we go further, examining the broader question of pharmaceutical contamination of water supplies, the specific conspiracy theories that have grown around it, and what the science actually shows. Detailed explanation: pharmaceutical contamination of drinking water is a real and documented phenomenon. When people take medication, their bodies metabolize only part of it. The rest is excreted and enters the wastewater system. Conventional water treatment processes were not designed to remove pharmaceutical compounds, and many pass through treatment plants largely intact, entering rivers, groundwater, and eventually drinking water supplies. In 2026, the largest study of drinking water pharmaceuticals to date, conducted by the EPA and the U.S. Geological Survey across 25 drinking water treatment plants, found a median concentration of all pharmaceuticals in treated water of 10.6 nanograms per liter. The most commonly detected substances included lithium, the antidepressant bupropion, the heart medication metoprolol, the anticonvulsant carbamazepine, and codeine, a metabolite of nicotine. A separate 2025 Minnesota study found that less than 1% of samples detected pharmaceuticals at all, with concentrations between 0.5 and 86 nanograms per liter. A study on opioids in drinking water found hydrocodone and codeine in 40% of tested samples, at levels between 0.3 and 20 nanograms per liter. The concentrations involved are extraordinarily small. Nanograms per liter means billionths of a gram per liter. The American Council on Science and Health noted in April 2026 that these levels are far below human health benchmarks, and that no study has found a potential health risk at currently detected concentrations. This is the scientific reality. The conspiracy theory begins where the science ends. Core elements of the theory: the first element is the Prozac in the water story. In the early 2000s, British environmental scientists detected trace levels of fluoxetine, the active ingredient in Prozac, in UK drinking water. The discovery was real and reported in peer-reviewed literature. Britain's Drinking Water Inspectorate stated it was likely to be found in considerably watered-down form, unlikely to pose health risks. Environmental campaigners nonetheless described it as hidden mass medication. The story spread globally and became one of the foundational pieces of the pharmaceutical water conspiracy theory. The second element is the deliberate addition claim. The conspiracy theory extends beyond accidental contamination to deliberate addition. The claim that governments or pharmaceutical companies are intentionally adding mood-altering, sedating, or behavior-modifying substances to public water supplies to make populations more docile, compliant, or dependent on pharmaceutical products. This claim has no documented evidence. No verified whistleblower, no leaked document, and no water analysis has ever confirmed deliberate addition of pharmaceutical compounds to public water supplies. The third element is the lithium question. Lithium occurs naturally in groundwater at varying concentrations depending on geology. Several epidemiological studies have found correlations between naturally elevated lithium levels in regional water supplies and lower rates of suicide and violent crime, findings that are scientifically interesting and have prompted proposals to consider low-level lithium supplementation in water in some contexts. For conspiracy believers, these proposals, discussed openly in academic literature, are evidence that the deliberate medication of populations through water is already being considered or implemented. For researchers, they represent an ongoing scientific debate about a naturally occurring mineral with potential public health implications. The fourth element is the regulatory gap. The 2026 EPA and USGS study is significant not just for what it found, but for what it revealed about oversight. As one environmental health publication noted, human health benchmarks for pharmaceuticals in drinking water had been in development for over 10 years and were only just being published. The regulatory framework for pharmaceutical water contamination has lagged significantly behind the science. For conspiracy believers, this lag reflects deliberate regulatory capture by pharmaceutical interests. For regulators, it reflects the difficulty of establishing health benchmarks for thousands of potential compounds at trace levels. Evidence for and against the evidence that pharmaceutical compounds are present in public drinking water at trace levels is confirmed by multiple independent studies in multiple countries. This is not disputed. The evidence that these levels pose a health risk is not established. Current concentrations are far below health benchmarks. The evidence for deliberate addition of pharmaceutical compounds to water supplies is absent. No study, no whistleblower, no document, and no water analysis has confirmed intentional pharmaceutical addition to public water. The contamination that exists is the byproduct of pharmaceutical use, excretion, and inadequate wastewater treatment, an environmental problem, not a conspiracy. The lithium question is the most nuanced element. Natural lithium variation in water is real. Its correlation with mental health outcomes is a legitimate area of research. Proposals to consider its implications are genuine academic discussions. None of this constitutes evidence of covert population medication. Arguments in favor of concerned critics argue that the distinction between accidental and deliberate contamination matters less than the outcome, that populations are consuming pharmaceutical substances in their drinking water without their knowledge or consent, regardless of how those substances got there. They point to the documented regulatory lag as evidence of institutional failure at minimum, and note that the same regulatory bodies that took 10 years to develop pharmaceutical benchmarks for water are the ones reassuring the public that current levels are safe. They also note that the discovery of pharmaceuticals in water was itself treated as a non-story by major media for years, and that the relative lack of public awareness of the phenomenon compared to its scientific documentation suggests something less than full transparency from relevant authorities. Arguments against environmental scientists argue that the concentrations involved are so far below therapeutic doses that any biological effect is implausible. A therapeutic dose of fluoxetine is 20 milligrams. The concentrations detected in water are in the range of nanograms, millionths of a therapeutic dose. The human body would need to drink tens of millions of liters of water to approximate a single therapeutic dose. They also note that the appropriate response to pharmaceutical water contamination is improved wastewater treatment, a legitimate environmental policy debate, rather than a conspiracy narrative that attributes accidental contamination to deliberate design. Public opinion and broader impact, the pharmaceutical water conspiracy theory has merged with the fluoride debate, the chemtrail theory, and the food addiction discussions to form a broader narrative about the systematic chemical management of populations through the substances they consume without awareness. This narrative is more emotionally compelling than any individual element because it speaks to a fundamental concern about bodily autonomy and informed consent. The legitimate underlying concern that people do not know what is in their water, that regulatory oversight of pharmaceutical contamination has been inadequate, and that the environmental impact of mass pharmaceutical use on water systems is poorly understood, is real and worth discussing. The conspiracy framing, however, substitutes deliberate intent for systemic failure in ways that make the genuine problem harder to address. Conclusion: is tap water being used to mass-medicate populations? The accidental presence of pharmaceutical compounds at trace levels is documented and real. Deliberate addition of pharmaceutical compounds to public water supplies has no evidential support. For believers, the documented presence of mood-affecting substances in public water, combined with regulatory inadequacy and the history of fluoridation, is sufficient to sustain the theory. For scientists, trace contamination at concentrations far below biological significance is an environmental issue requiring better wastewater treatment, not evidence of a pharmaceutical conspiracy. What is certain is this: pharmaceutical compounds are in the water. Regulators took 10 years to develop the benchmarks to assess them. And the question of what else is there, at what level, and with what long-term effect, has not been fully answered. This is the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. If tonight's episode made you think, please rate and follow on Spotify. Tomorrow on the Conspiracy Theory Analyst, the WEF and Klaus Schwab. Who really runs the World Economic Forum? That's next.